He hated organizational charts, and he couldn't stand multiple layers of faceless rubber stamps. Kern's managerial style is best summarized on this slide. He was the man behind the scenes pulling strings. He took a huge amount of responsibility upon himself, and he did most of the heavy lifting. After several years in his job, Kern discovered that Southwestern was not the easiest place to govern. As the faculty grew, it acquired more and more prima donnas, many of whom had gigantic egos. Sometimes the egos came in pairs. Kern was besieged by faculty members who had outgrown their laboratory space. His initial reaction was to pass these complaints off as a distortion of reality. But then Kern came up with a bright idea, and Mike will now tell you about Kern's bright idea.
Well, what was Kern's bright idea? It was simple. Build a new campus on the north side of Harry Hines. Space problems be gone. Building research buildings on the North Campus required a delicate balance. There were many priorities that had to be balanced: financial, political, scientific, and clinical. Kern balanced them all except for one snag. Some of the more vocal members of the faculty demanded that Kern build a transportation system to connect the North and South campuses. Eventually, Kern approved the Campus Connector, an expensive structure that the people in Austin call Nobel Laureates Drive. The single connector is sufficient for now, but if we continue to build at the current pace, it'll soon look like this. As a devotee of the arts, Kern had to have art in his new building, so he commissioned the famous glass artist Dale Chihuly to craft an enormous glass sculpture more than 20 feet high. It's composed entirely of delicate bulbs and strands of glass. Kern chose to color it orange in honor of UT. Someone said it looked like a carrot gone bad. But Kern made one mistake. He placed this delicate piece of glass in the lobby of the C building, just below the psychiatry clinic. I'm still waiting for a deluded, paranoid schizophrenic to attack this monster with a baseball bat. Kern broke all records in fundraising for buildings and programs, but his biggest success came with endowed chairs. He raised endowments for more than 200 chairs. The biggest chair of all will be the Kern Wildenthal chair, which the faculty endowed in his honor. But Kern didn't raise money only for chairs. He also raised money for tables. The trouble is that there are only 4 tables for the 200 chairs. Rumors have it that the 4 Calatrava tables cost more than the 200 chairs. But I'm told this is not true. For the first time in 40 years, Kern will be leaving the nest. But he won't be going far. He's flying only 2.5 miles due southeast to Southwest Medical Foundation. Well, Joe and I have spent a lot of time on birds in this talk. It's appropriate because Kern has had several battles with birds. In 1986, after Kern took office, all hell broke loose when the school invaded a bird sanctuary while building a tennis court. Egret lovers rose up in protest, and the federal government threatened to prosecute. Fortunately, all charges were eventually dismissed, but you note that it took 2 years. Kern deserves a special toast for learning how to handle a hostile media, which this early lesson with the birds stood him in good stead 20 years later. Well, you heard from Joe how Kern had a nose for picking academic stars. He also had a nose for beauty. Marnie, Kern's loving companion of 44 years, rounded out Kern's persona by adding charm and grace. Kern has painted a beautiful picture of UT Southwestern, but his task is not complete. In his role at the Southwestern Medical Foundation, Kern will add the last limb to this magnificent picture. Fortunately, Kern's clairvoyance is still intact. He's leaving the campus in the hands of a brilliant successor. Joe and I are confident that President Podolsky will hatch into a magnificent eagle just like Kern. Thank you.
That could be interpreted in a different fashion if you think about it. It's certainly my honor to introduce our last speaker, who will complete this picture by speaking to the impact that Kern has had well beyond Dallas and here at UT Southwestern. And from this foundation, his influence on the entire UT system. Dr. Ken Shine joins us as the interim chancellor of the UT system and executive vice chancellor for health affairs. Many here will know that Ken is himself a distinguished academician who contributed as a cardiologist and physiologist and has served many important roles in academic institutions across this country. For many years, chair of cardiology at UCLA and then dean and provost there. And then in 1992 and for a 10-year period thereafter as the president of the Institute of Medicine. And I think few doubt how Ken transformed the Institute of Medicine as a vehicle for addressing important issues in healthcare in this country, most notably in putting on the map the issues of quality of care and patient safety, which are increasingly appropriately dominating the national debate. In 2003, he came to UT system for the role he serves now, and we are fortunate to have him here this afternoon to join us in talking about Kern's impact on the state as a whole. Thank you.
I came to Texas largely because of Kern Wildenthal. I had known Kern for many years because our interests in cardiac physiology and cardiac metabolism overlapped, and so I knew him as a scientist, and as you've heard, he was a hell of a good researcher. I knew Kern with regard to his commitment to clinical issues, the reservations of some of the faculty notwithstanding, because as dean at UCLA, he asked me to write a letter about whether this institution ought to build a private hospital, which eventually became the Zale Lipsche Hospital. And I spent a fair amount of time thinking about that and providing that kind of background. Much has been made of Kern's fundraising capacity, but I'll remind you how remarkable in the big picture that capacity has been. Well into the 1970s and early 1980s in this country, philanthropists felt that if they were paying taxes, that their taxes went to support public institutions, and that they were being asked to give twice if they paid taxes and provided gifts. Kern's capacity to convince individuals to support a tax-supported institution, a public institution, was an extraordinary accomplishment. And those of us who knew him in the 80s when he announced that that was going to be a major strategy were impressed again, as with Zale Lipsche, that here was an individual with vision and courage and energy who was going into an area which was really rather different. And of course, his success during that period of time has been a model for all public institutions, including many others in Texas, where providing those kinds of resources have been so important. And finally, some of you know that Joe and Mike were house officers with me. I was the resident at the Massachusetts General Hospital when they were interns. And I figured that anybody who could manage them had to be a hell of a good leader. When I came to Texas, I discovered that Kern clearly had a reputation within the state and the system, which was in many ways unique. When I was discussing with a couple of the newer regents at that time about the various leaders within the system, I remember one of them commenting, explaining to the other regent that, oh yes, Dr. Wildenthal was the president at UT Southwestern. He was the fellow with the edifice complex. The fact is, he had an edifice complex, and it led to the North Campus, and again represented his vision. The funding of higher education in this state is an arcane sport. It involves things called formulas for education, for instruction, for infrastructure. Not more than 3 people in the entire state understand the formulas.